lab. Indirect calorimetry measures heat release by a calculation, and it also takes into consideration consumption of oxygen as well as CO2, carbon dioxide, that's expired, that's measured. And again, it's not really practical or something that we'd use in a healthcare setting. The respiratory quotient I wanted to mention simply because if you do end up working in a clinical setting, sometimes you'll use this, particularly when you have a patient on a vent or a ventilator in the ICU, to make sure when you're feeding them that you're not causing increased production of carbon dioxide. That's very important. So I actually, when I worked in the hospitals, used to calculate the RQ, or the respiratory quotient, to make sure that I wasn't providing them excess carbohydrate, which indeed would increase carbon dioxide production, which we didn't want while they were on a ventilator. And that in particular came into play when they were on TPN, or its total parenteral nutrition, which is essentially IV feedings. And that also can be done with a calculation measuring gas exchange. If you want to know more about these types of things, become friends with a respiratory therapist. They're a great source of knowledge with in terms of learning about these types of tests. So what exactly are the components of energy expenditure? In other words, what do we look at to determine how many calories we burn? Well, there's your basal metabolic rate, which essentially is the calories that you burn just to exist. Your cardiac system, circulatory system, breathing, just being. There's physical activity, so that does take into account moving about during your day, and then above and beyond that, do you exercise? Do you have some type of physical activity plan that you engage in on a daily or weekly basis? Thermic effect of food, so how many calories do we expend when we process or digest our food? And thermoregulation, maintaining our appropriate body temperature. And this just simply shows you a comparison of how each one of those look in comparison to each other. So just contrasting, where the majority of the calories you burn. It's usually from your BMR, your basal metabolic rate. Energy expenditure for physical activity is going to depend, on whether or not you exercise and how active you are. I sit behind a desk most days, so I'm a lot less active than my husband, who's a contractor, obviously. And you can see the thermic effect of food doesn't contribute a large number of calories. At one time, there was this big push to consume, or one of the reasoning behind the low carbohydrate, high protein diets was, oh, you'll burn more calories if you eat more protein. Yeah, it's negligible. So that went out the door. So what's your BMR? Well, I said it was just what you expend just to be. So respiration, heartbeat, renal function, to make sure that your organ systems are functioning properly. Those are the calories you need to maintain them. What factors influence your basic metabolic rate? Well, your body composition. We know that adipose tissue is a lot less metabolically active than, say, skeletal tissue. Your gender and your age. Obviously, if you're pregnant, you have a different BMR. You're growing in other humans, so it increases. Environmental temperature does actually play a role in that BMR. You've got to vasodilate if you're in some tropical Caribbean setting. Unfortunately, I'm not. I think it's supposed to be the coldest day of the year here. Go figure, it's March. It is usually measured in the post-absorptive state, so meaning after you've consumed a meal. You got to sit motionless, which is hard for me, in a supine position, thermoneutral environment, so it's not too hot, not too cold. There's a precise way to measure this. We can also calculate it. And they actually measure your oxygen consumption for 10 minutes. Much easier to do the predictive equations for RMR. We're not going to, again, in a clinical setting, we're not going to measure somebody's oxygen consumption for 10 minutes to determine their RMR for each patient that I would see. There's a number of different predictive equations. I'm partial to the Harris-Benedict. That doesn't mean it's better than any of the other equations. It's the one I learned, and old habits die hard, quite frankly. I think that's what it is. Check out some of those equations. You might see the weight-only equations usually take the actual body weight and then multiply by a factor per per kilogram or per pound, depending on the formula, and it's much less accurate or precise. I don't usually do that unless I'm talking in generalities. So energy expenditure related to physical activity. We know that skeletal muscle requires much more energy, as I was telling you, than adipose tissue when physically active. And that accounts for 10 to 30% of that daily energy expenditure. So the number of calories that you need per day is 10 to 30% will come from physical activity. And when you quantify the energy expenditure of physical activity, you're looking at the difference between the RMR, so your resting, or your BMR, your basal metabolic rate, and how much you spend total for the day. That difference, and again, we're back to gas exchange, which is why I told you to make friends with a respiratory therapist. If you really want to do it precisely, again, that's in a university lab or a research facility. And this is going to be calculated for purposes that we'll be talking about by using predictive equations, or when you're actually out in the workforce, you'll be using predictive equations, unless of course you work in a research facility. The thermic effect of food I mentioned already. There is a slight increase associated with the digestion of the food that you eat. Protein does have the greatest thermic effect. I don't argue that. It's just that it's not as great an effect as was being pushed or marketed with a low carbohydrate diet craze. In terms of thermoregulation, we do need to maintain homeostasis, our body's core temperature. If you drop your temperature, or you can have a drop in temperature for up to 10 degrees or an increase of 5 degrees. So that's kind of the leeway we have. Quick story, I used to, back in the day, usually take a getaway to the tropics somewhere, and I would go snorkeling, and even in the nice Caribbean water, I would rapidly lose heat. So just snorkeling for half hour, 45 minutes, I would get back in the boat and I had uncontrollable shaking, and to the point where the other people who had gone on the snorkeling expedition with us said to my husband, "Is she having seizures?" So I really can't regulate my body temperature that well, even in warm tropical waters, with that loss of heat. Remember, heat transfers. So I would shake, in an attempt to, that was my involuntary trembling, shaking, like when you're cold. Well, that was my body's attempt to increase my body temperature. And just so you know, now I wear a wetsuit when I go snorkeling. People make fun of me at the university pool. It's quite cold, and I actually put on a wetsuit to swim. And I don't swim that often, but there is just a very narrow range that we humans can tolerate in terms of temperature. Heat stress, I think anybody who's exercised knows that when you exercise, when you lace them up and go, you sweat. So muscular activity can generate a significant amount of heat. What do you do when you're cold? I'd like to think that I do some, push-ups or jog around the building or the block where I am, but that can actually warm your body temperature. So next time somebody says they're cold, you can tell them to do that and let me know what they say. This is kind of interesting, I think. I told you I can't sit still. My husband even more so, he's tapping his leg or his foot or, shaking his knee. We were fidgeting, the kid that fidgeted in class all the time. They actually, that was actually a good thing, probably not for the teacher, but in terms of the energy expenditure as they enter adulthood, it's energy spent on this involuntary skeletal muscle activity. So fidgeting, shivering, I think that's the word I was trying to find when I was telling you about getting cold while snorkeling, that uncontrolled shivering. And that can account in certain individuals for 100 to 800 additional calories burned a day. So pretty significant. I also want to tell you another quick story about body temperature. I had a graduate student, a young male, so in his 20s, and he told me that during high school, no one wanted to sit next to him because he generated so much heat. He literally gave off that much heat. And interestingly enough, he was an exercise phys major. They measured his BMR, his RMR, so his resting metabolic rate. Get this, RMR, 5,000 calories just for him to be. So no activity, no thermic effect of food, no NEAT. So clearly there's a genetic component there. I can't say I've ever heard of that. And the physiology professor was blown away too. He had to consume a tremendous amount of calories to maintain his body weight, his musculature. And he said his brother was the same way. So clearly there's a genetic influence there, which I think is fascinating. So how much should we weigh? Well, everybody argues about that. There's a number of methods to calculate body fat. Usually you need special equipment. And I say that, but now most of the scales can measure body composition. You can go to, some of the local box stores and get a pretty nice scale at a pretty reasonable price. It's fairly accurate. You usually look at weight to height, obviously. Whether you're 5'2" or 5'9" comes into play, and how we look at what your body weight is. There's tables that have been done that are associated with mortality. There's ideal body weight formulas. There is no perfect formula or table, quite frankly. Interestingly, the story goes, whether or not it's true, I don't know, the Metropolitan Life tables were used to determine ideal body weight, but the subjects, if you will, that they used to do these regression calculations or regression analysis were smokers, and they tend to be on the leaner side. So they developed these tables based on people who tend to be on the leaner side, and it also obviously was to their advantage. They sell life insurance, so they can probably jack up your weight if you're not within their ideal body weight. But lo and behold, that's the gold standard that we use now. I don't know if it's the gold standard, but that's what everybody uses, the ideal body weight. 100 pounds for women for the first 5 feet, and then 5 pounds per inch after that. Men it's 100 and then 6 pounds after that. So go figure. Body composition. There's two major components. There's the fat-free mass, so body water, your mineral-rich tissues, protein, your skeletal tissue, your organs, and then there's the fat. But remember, fat is in cell membranes, certain bones, marrow, that's fat, and then the nervous tissues. So don't forget about those myelin sheaths that have a fat covering. That's a nice picture of a big old adipocyte there, or a lipocyte. I call them adipocytes. So all cells have some lipids, but again, lipid cell membrane. Cell membrane has lipid, but adipose cells actually store a droplet of triglyceride or fat. So if you overeat, you can increase the fat cell size and number. Once fat cells are there, they're forever unless they die or you have liposuction. BMI, body mass index, again, something that's used with fairly frequently, or routinely, I should say. There's the calculation. There's lots of body mass BMI calculators. It is used in children. However, I think waist circumference is, and so do a lot of providers right now, is better than BMI. I remember learning about BMI way back in the day in college. My brother played football. He was a linebacker. He was very muscular. He had to be. So when I thought, well, I'll calculate his body mass index. I'm learning about this, and I thought, it says he's obese, and I think he had at the time 6 or 8% body fat, and I thought something's wrong here. And really, I'm dating myself, they really hadn't realized at the time that BMI is not that great for athletes. Obviously, it's well known now, or for elderly folks who tend to lose body mass, lean body tissue, and become, they have more adipose tissue as we age. Sorry to break it to you guys. So you have to, there's no absolutes when it comes to these things. And you have to look at the person you're assessing. You can't just go, by the textbook formula and classify them. You've got to take into a number of factors and look at the individual. So I just wanted to show you this table to classify BMI in terms of obesity classification. They do use this to determine whether or not you qualify for a surgical weight loss procedure, such as the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass procedure. They still use it this way. So how are we going to measure body composition? I apologize, my lecture's a bit longer than I had intended. There's a number of ways. There's skin fold thickness. Unless you do a lot of these, they're not very accurate. So if you pick up your calipers and do them once a month, not so much. Bioelectrical impedance measures conductivity. Usually, some of the scales now use this that you can buy. And there's also a device that they can it's like a red laser light on a number of sites, predetermined sites on the body. The bod pods are so cool. If you ever go to the Academy, FNCE, the Academy Nutrition and Dietetics annual conferences, somebody usually has, a vendor has a bod pod. I've never gotten in one because the line's too long, but it measures a change in pressure, kind of like Archimedes, with the volume of air that you displace. And it's fairly accurate for measuring body fat, body composition. And I didn't know about this, but there's actually one, it's so cute, called the P pod for very young children. And here's a picture of the bod pod. If you're claustrophobic, probably not for you. And it's non-invasive, obviously, and it's fairly accurate. I told you about the calipers, multiple body sites by trained people. That's not me. I'm not very good at it. It's inexpensive and it's easy. If you go to the gym, probably they're going to measure your skin fold thickness. Make sure you get somebody who knows what they're doing, else you'll take a hit to your self-esteem, or I would. Underweight body weighing, this is cool, but not something I would want to do. We did this in one of my exercise phys classes. I didn't do it. I don't want to put a bathing suit on in front of people, and I don't want to get in this little tank and have to hold my breath. Does not sound like fun. It's really, really accurate. They have one at the University of Maine. It's called hydrostatic weighing, and it is one of the most accurate methods. But obviously, can you see dunking your patients to measure their body fat composition? Yeah, not too realistic. DEXA, dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. This is another good one. And it's not very much radiation. It's very accurate. Initially, it was used to assess whether or not someone has osteoporosis, or to the extent. And then they thought, it also is really good at measuring body composition as well. I've got a little schematic there for you how it works. It's accurate. It is a gold standard. It's obviously expensive. I'm not sure that your insurance company is going to cover a DEXA scan to measure your body composition. That concludes my little bit long-winded lecture, and we have one more to go for this chapter. I'll see you then. Take care now. Bye-bye.